Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie, and I worked for Audubon, Connecticut this summer, monitoring our breeding sites in Eastern Connecticut. And tonight, I'm just going to kind of be giving a summary of piping plovers at our Eastern sites, as well as a little overview of our most active site, Sandy Point in West Haven. Okay, so the first beach is at Bluff Point State Park, and we had 7 breeding pairs on Bushy Beach with 9 plover nests. In total, 31 eggs were laid, in which 16 of those hatched, and only 2 went on to fledge. And at this site in particular, there is a lot of disturbance that comes from boaters and off-leash dogs. And often boaters will bring dogs on shore later in the day, and due to the remoteness of that site, it makes it really challenging for us to intervene with that disturbance all the time. But many times when I would come across an off-leash dog there, I would see adult plovers kind of on high alert, running up to it, flying over to it, because they perceived it as a predator, meaning that they either weren't on their nest or they weren't protecting their young. And the 2 pairs that successfully fledged a chick, they nested in between the start and the middle of the beach, but the bulk of the pairs nested closer to the tip where boats will often pull up and where the disturbance is greatest. And a number of nests at the tip were abandoned or unviable, and whatever chicks did hatch were unsuccessful, which isn't uncommon in an area where disturbance is high and the birds are often off their nest or away from their young. But this year at Bushy, something really unique happened. A piping plover nest at the tip was commandeered after being abandoned by a pair of American oyster catchers, which you can see in that picture. And they actually just enlarged the nest scrape and started laying their eggs. They did eventually push the plover eggs out, but it was really cool to kind of be able to document that. And we also had one of the only successful mainland oyster catchers nest there, and they fledged 2 chicks, which was really cool. And then you can go to the next slide. So on the other side of Bluff Point State Park, we have Mumford Cove, which had 4 breeding pairs of plovers this year. There were 6 nests and a total of 23 eggs laid between the 4 pairs. And of those 23 eggs, 10 hatched and 8 fledged. For the most part, the eastern breeding sites didn't experience as much damage as the western breeding sites during those several different weather events we had this summer. But Mumford Cove did have 2 pairs that were nesting at the tip during that Memorial Day storm, and unfortunately they were washed out, but they did re-nest pretty quickly, and they each pair fledged 2, or one fledged 3 chicks and one fledged 1. And even though Mumford has like a smaller nesting area and is right next to Bushy, there was higher success here because it gets a lot less human disturbance due to how remote it is. And you can go to the next slide. Okay, so at Harkness Memorial Park in Waterford, we had 5 breeding pairs of piping plovers and 6 nests this year. A total of 21 eggs were laid, and of those 19 hatch and 6 went on to fledge. As you might know, the section of the beach where the plovers nest there is close to the public, and it's often separated by a creek that connects to the ocean, making like a natural barrier for park goers. However, this summer with all of our weather events, that barrier that's normally there got covered by sand a lot, which kind of made a bridge for park goers to access that side of the beach, as well as raise the water level of the creek. And the creek has a lot of sandbars that's used by the piping plovers and by a lot of other passing by birds. So when those got covered up, it really pushed them to the shoreline where disturbance was greater. And especially with these birds who have historically nested there, they just weren't really used to having people around. So that was a challenge for there. Next slide. So I have these 2 beaches together. There are 2 of our smaller private beaches that we each have 1 breeding pair of plovers at, and they each had 1 nest each this year. And at each site, 4 eggs were laid, 4 hatched, and 4 fledged. And we see success at these smaller beaches because a lot of the time beachgoers and residents take an interest in the birds, and they often will act as stewards for them when we're not there, whether it's sharing the shore or watching them and updating us when we visit. The Hatchett Point pair did have their nest washed over during that Memorial Day weather event, but they remained on the nest and they saved all 4 eggs. And also believe that this was the first year, or at least the first year in a while, we had a pair nest at Old Black Point. And that nest was actually only reported a few days prior to it hatching, but amazingly, the pair was able to incubate and hatch all 4 eggs without being exposed for like the last 4 days, which was cool. Next slide. Okay, so Mile Creek is another one of our smaller private beaches that we have a pair of piping plovers at. And this year they had 2 different nests. In total, they laid 8 eggs. Of those, 5 hatched and 4 fledged. The first nest was lost after hatching 1 chick, likely due to predation or human disturbance. However, the pair renested quickly, laying a full clutch of 4, in which all 4 did later fledge. Something we have to be really attentive about on all those smaller beaches or beaches where pairs don't nest every year is beach raking. And many times at beaches where it's raked regularly, we can miss plover nests, which can cause new pairs to kind of pop up in new places throughout the season. But that's why it's always important to report any possible plover nests at any beaches you may be at throughout the season, so we can make sure that all nests are properly protected and monitored. Move to the next slide. And so at Griswold Point in Lyme, we had 2 breeding pairs of piping plovers with a total of 2 confirmed nests. 6 eggs were laid. Out of those 6, only 3 hatched and 2 went on to fledge. Something interesting that happened here this year was that one of the pairs laid a full clutch of 4. They hatched 1 chick, which was lost pretty quickly, likely to predation, but they continued to incubate the nest for an extra month, even though the eggs were most likely no longer viable. And then they officially abandoned it after a whole month. But some common issues we see here has to do with boats and kayaks pulling up in prohibited areas, causing the birds to leave the nest or young chicks. And Griswold Point is a really beautiful place to kayak and take your boat out. But it's just important to remind people to respect the no landing sign and to pay attention to the behaviors of the birds. A small colony of least terns attempted to nest there this year, but they were unsuccessful due to disturbance and not adequately being able to incubate their nests. And that plover pair that did abandon its nest after continuing to incubate for a month, they were at the tip where the disturbance was definitely the most extreme. And then you move to the next. Okay, and finally we have Sandy Point Bird Sanctuary in West Haven, which was our most active site this year with 15 breeding pairs of piping plovers, as well as being home to one of our only mainland least tern colonies and a small colony of common tern and black skimmers. So in total, we had 23 piping plover nests laid, containing 79 eggs. Of those 79 eggs, 31 hatched and 24 chicks went on to fledge. Sandy Point is subject to a lot of disturbance at all hours of the day. However, with the help of our wildlife guards, as well as all of you amazing volunteers, we were able to successfully fledge 24 chicks this year, which is awesome. And Sandy Point is a really special place, not just for the plovers and the terns, but also a lot of migrating shorebirds. And with the help of volunteers and residents who help monitor the birds and act as stewards for the site by helping collect trash and turning over flipped horseshoe crabs, we are creating a safer place for all the vulnerable migrants to rest and refuel, such as the roseate spoonbill and the red knot, which were some passerbys this year. But yeah, we can go to my final slide. Once again, I just wanted to thank you all for all your help this year. I really enjoyed getting to meet some of you out in the field and getting to monitor together.
Awesome. Thank you, Natalie. So if anybody has any questions for Natalie, you can go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because Beth is going to start sharing her screen for the next part of the presentation. If you have a question, by all means, please feel free to throw it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, Beth, I think you can go ahead and get started.
Okay, I apologize. I'm having screen sharing issues. I just lost everybody. I'm so happy that I found you all. So we're going to try this one more time. Here, let me try and do this. Apologize for the delay. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So hello, everybody. My name's Beth Amendola with Audubon, Connecticut as well. I spend most of my time monitoring our oyster catchers on our offshore islands. And I'm just going to give you an overview of the entire breeding population and then talk about some other projects we're working on with oyster catchers here in Connecticut. So this season, we actually had our highest number of breeding pairs ever.
Hey,
So,
Beth,
yeah.
we're seeing like the preview version, like where it has like the slide and then has the next slide to the side.
All right, let's just do it this way. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, let's go with that. Okay, so there we go. So we ended up with 78 breeding pairs this season, which is our highest ever. And it's even higher if you include the non-breeding pairs with our breeding pairs from last season. The reason for this might just be because we're missing some pairs. Our birds nest on these tiny offshore islands, and it's a lot of sites and a lot of ground to cover. So we may just be missing pairs, and we might have just done a much better job of getting to them all this year. We fledged 50 chicks, which is our second highest, which is another record. It did bring our productivity down slightly from what it normally is. We've been pretty good at having a 0.7 or a 0.8 the last few years. This year we were at 0.64, and really I think that's just because we had a much higher number of pairs. We are well above the population recovery goal of 0.5 for American oyster catchers, and our 10-year average is above that with 0.7. So with the increased number of pairs, some of them may be new breeders and not very experienced. And we also had a lot of issues with the storms and predation. The birds on the islands were also susceptible to that. So if we compare our beach nesting oyster catchers to our island nesting oyster catchers, there's a very big difference in productivity. About 80% of our population breeds on our offshore islands. And last year was the first year the birds on the mainland actually had a higher productivity than the birds on the islands. And I think it's just the birds on the mainland, one, it's only 20% of the breeding population, and they are just much more susceptible to, human disturbance, predation, lower ground with our high tide storms that come and just wipe them out. This year, our birds did really well on the islands with a 0.7 productivity. And one of the islands that is actually one of our hot spots for productivity is Kokini Island, Westport. It actually has the highest number of breeding pairs on one island, which is 14. And there's also a large common tern colony there, and it's up to about 200 pairs now. So some differences that we saw, we all had to suffer through COVID last year, but it actually helps the birds quite a bit. So at 3 of our beaches, which most of you may know, there were restrictions. So they were either closed completely or they were closed just to, residents. The visitation was restricted. And at Milford Point, we had a daily monitor who was, helping to deal with some of the human disturbance. And if you can see last year, our oyster catchers at these 3 beaches did exceptionally well. It was our first successful nest at Campo Beach ever, and they've been trying for 5 years. And then you can look at what happened this year. So our COVID restrictions dropped. We went back to normal, if not higher beach visitation and increasing human disturbance. And you can see the productivity at these 3 beaches just just dropped off dramatically. Really goes to show how much human disturbance really impacts productivity of these birds at these beaches. So one of our oystercatcher projects that we're working on is our banding project, which many of you probably know about and have seen quite a few of our birds out there. To date, we've banded 46 individuals. It's about 25% of our breeding population, so we're making some ground there. We have banded 4 fledglings. We also recite quite a few non-Connecticut birds. So this season we had 11 red-banded and 1 orange-banded oystercatcher. The red-banded birds are primarily from Georgia, and the orange is from New York or New Jersey. We have 15 recites for our Connecticut banded birds, and their winter recites range anywhere from New York to Florida. The majority of them are in Florida, and we've had that one fun bird who decided to go all the way down to the west coast of Central America. Kind of exciting, we had our first recite of one of our fledglings this past spring in April. The bird was recited on the west coast of Florida, just south of Cedar Key. So we're learning a lot about our birds just from banding. We're getting a lot of information about where the important staging areas are in Connecticut. Milford Point, you know, we can see numbers up to 70 to 150 oyster catchers there in the fall. That's where we've been seeing a lot of the red-banded birds who are not breeding here in Connecticut stop over to rest before they keep heading down south. And Monongahela Island in Westbrook is beginning to be a really, really big hot spot for staging for these birds. And we've been seeing a bunch more red bands there and orange bands as well. With the banding, we're able to track their reproductive success over, you know, the seasons. This photo here is of N03 and its mate N02 were banded in 2018 on Kokini Island, and they have returned every year and have breeded in the exact same territory. And this year they were successful at fledging 3 chicks, which is really great. We're actually getting information about how much these birds switch mates and breeding territories. We really thought that they kind of came back to the same territory and the same mate, you know, as we see with N03 and N02. But we've actually had 7 of our birds switch sites or switch mates. In a couple cases, they've done both. So we're really learning a lot more about their breeding behavior and their movements during the breeding season. Another one of our projects is we have started, well, a couple of years ago, I think 2019, we started putting up nest cameras on oystercatcher nests. This was to inform us on, you know, predators. What are the predators that are really getting to the nests? How are these high tide storms really affecting the nests? How much human disturbance are we not actually, you know, seeing while we're out there monitoring? And also when we're not there, it helps us evaluate our nest fates. So we go and we see a failed nest, we have to put it in as failed, but with the cameras, we can see that they actually hatched 2 chicks, but the chicks didn't survive within that period that we were able to get back and monitor. So it's definitely helping us with data collection as well. So our cameras are catching all kinds of fun things, lots of disturbances. So we've had great horned owls near the nesting area, coyotes, deer. This picture of the oystercatcher with the 2 chicks, we actually recorded the nest getting washed over by a high tide storm. The eggs completely moved out of the nest bowl to a new spot, and the birds resumed incubation, and they actually successfully hatched 2 of the eggs. This picture down here is unfortunate. You can see the timestamp. It's from 2:50 a.m. and this was at Sandy Point. These folks are actually all inside the string fencing, right where all our terns were nesting. So there's a lot of disturbance that goes on while we're not there monitoring, and the cameras are really helping us figure that out, and that way we can brainstorm ways that we can try and reduce all this disturbance to help the birds. So that's it for me. Are there any questions? Don't think I see any hands raised, Corey. So,
Okay, well then we can turn it over to Laura. And one more person I forgot to acknowledge, Rebecca, our the seasonal for the state of Connecticut, is in the audience tonight too. So just wanted to put a shout out to Rebecca, who is amazing and does phenomenal work. So, okay, Laura, it is all you. Go for it. Oh, we got one question in the chat. Hold on. Nope, it was not a question. Congratulations on a successful season from Jennifer. So thank you, Jennifer. Okay, turning it over to Laura.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, is everyone seeing my screen?
Yes.
Great. Now I just have to move this bar out of the way. There we go. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the piping plover and lease turn project results. So, you know, we've been doing this for a while and I was trying to think of how I can make this exciting. So the season overview had, you know, challenging weather, challenging predators, challenging turn results, and shenanigans amuck. So I want to thank Kat for putting up a camera out at Mumford Point to kind of catch some of the shenanigans from the neighbors. So we had some ATV incidents that forced us to actually have to post that Mumford Point was closed to motorized vehicles, which most of us thought was common sense, but you know how it goes. So some of the pros of this season were that most of the municipal fireworks were canceled, which is great, according to me. Perhaps not other people, but we did have a new breeding beach that Natalie talked about, Old Black Point Beach, which is great. I love seeing birds at new beaches. Some of the cons were that we had a rat predation issue at Long Beach. We had ATV shenanigans at 3 sites. You know, fires within the string fencing. We had drone issues at 2 sites. You know, dogs at all sites. That one potential take that Katerina talked about. Kiteboarding issues at 3 sites. Organized groups such as a kayak summer camp out at Griswold Point and some bird walks at Mumford Point. We had unmonitored beach raking at 4 different sites. We had, some photographer conflicts at 3 sites. And we had some lease turn mortality and some common turn mortality, which I'll talk about in depth a little bit more. But with regards to piping plovers, this year we had 60 pairs and we fledged 80 young. So that's pretty good. We had a productivity of 1.33 chicks produced per pair. And I love this photo that Patrick took here of the no dog sign and the dog behind it. So that makes me cackle a bit. So the site-by-site results. So I'm just going to go to the beaches we haven't really talked too much about. So Campo Beach had one, Campo Beach in Westport had 1 pair, but unfortunately they were not successful this year. Long Beach was unfortunately a bust. There's 9 pairs, which is great, but only 1 chick fledged, and that was the site where we had, you know, we not only had the Memorial Day washouts and then the super high tide in June that washed out the re-nest of the nests that got washed out on Memorial Day, but Long Beach had rats getting into the exclosures. So there's really only 2 predators that tend to be able to get into the exclosures, and that is rats and weasels. The exclosures keep out most of the other stuff. So Short Beach had a pair, and they fledged 3 young, which is great. Kat talked about Mumford Point. Cedar Beach, which is the beach with lots of shenanigans next to the sandbar, did have a pair that fledged one young. Natalie went over the eastern beaches, Mount Creek, Hatchett Point, Old Black Point, and Harkness. Bluff Point, and I'm not sure if she went over Mumford Cove or not, but there were 4 pairs out there, which is a good number. 6 nests and 8 fledged, which is pretty darn good. And our friends out at the Rhode Island Refuges, who monitor Sandy Point Island, which is part of it's in Connecticut, part of it's in Rhode Island, and the tip, which is the western tip, is part of this town of Stonington, and a pair nested out there this year and fledged 1 chick, so that's pretty cool. And just a quick reminder, the metrics that we're kind of looking at are 1.2 chicks produced per pair is an indication of a static population. So if you kind of have that 1.2 chicks produced every year, your population is holding steady. Anything less, obviously you have a downward trend. 1.5 chicks produced per pair is indicative of an increasing population. So, and take those numbers and kind of match them up with these average number of fledges per pair, and that's kind of what we're looking at year after year. So this is our breeding pairs of piping plovers. Since we first started intensively monitoring piping plovers back in '84 till now. So that looks like a pretty nice looking graph, if you ask me. But I want to throw in this next graph, which takes those breeding pairs, which is this red line, which is increasing. And then you have the purple line, which is the productivity of those pairs. You have that 1.2 chicks produced per pair, which is like the stable population line, if you will. And then we have this green line, which is interesting. So it's dipping a little bit, meaning a little bit less productivity. So a bit of a negative trend, but so that's interesting. You have increasing pairs, but decreasing productivity. So what does that mean? I hypothesize that it means that we have more birds showing up at these major sites. So we don't often have expansion of birds to newer sites. Like Campo Beach was a new scenario last year, and Old Black Point this year, which is great. It's great to see some expansion. But for the most part, we have just more pairs showing up to Long Beach and more pairs showing up to Bluff Point and Sandy Point. And, that sometimes creates scenarios where you get, more birds fighting for the same resources. Or if you have, lots of predators at that one site, you're going to take a bigger hit to your population at that site. So if you've heard the, don't put all your eggs in one basket, I think that that's kind of what we're looking at here. We really would like to see the birds spread out more kind of evenly across the state, because there are some pretty nice beaches out there that just don't have birds because the beaches are not managed in such a way that the birds can even settle down. So yeah, I will get off my soapbox. All right, so these turns. Sorry for the death slides here, but so we had let's see, 3, 6, 9 colonies of lease turns this year, with some pretty typical dismal productivity, but the jury's still out as to the fate of lease turns. The adult pair numbers across the region are holding pretty steady. So we think that because they're a longer lived species and they're so, they move around a lot. And we've kind of felt some of we've had colonies show up late in the season. So obviously those colonies failed somewhere and then came to Connecticut to nest. So I think the birds have some strategies for eking out an existence, considering like the poor productivity that we do have this year and have had. But anyhow, so there was a hatchling mortality event. We think we had a gray horned owl taken out the heads of chicks. So we had 12 chicks that were lost, and basically they were found with no heads. And talking to some colleagues, the general consensus was that that's great horned owl behavior, which is kind of amazing to me because the chicks are so small. You would think that they would just eat the whole darn thing and not just eat the head, but who am I? But in addition to that, there was also a hatchling mortality event that coincided with a decline in the colony size within a quick time period, within like a 2-week time period. So adults were seen consistently bringing food back to the chicks, which is, when you see a colony decide to just take off, one of the questions that pops into our mind is, well, maybe there's just not enough food for the chicks, but it seems like there's enough food. But Rebecca and others noticed that there were dead and dying hatchlings, as you can see by the 2 red circles and then the picture in the middle. Rebecca did collect 2 that we brought to UConn for testing, and the results are still pending for those 2. So just a little bit about the tern productivity, least tern productivity that I was kind of talking about. We've got the number of colonies has remained somewhat steady. It's usually 7 to 11 colonies spread out throughout the state. The pairs, it varies, and the productivity obviously varies, and so the general trend for that productivity is, a downward trend. Unfortunately, these terns are tricky. We're still trying to figure them out. But to talk a little bit more about terns, there was an additional tern mortality event, which was mostly common terns, along with some laughing gulls and roseate terns. This event happened like August and September during migration, and dead and dying terns were found in West Haven, Milford, Bridgeport, Groton, Old Lyme, New Haven, Waterford. A lot of them at Sandy Point. That could be a sampling bias thing, but I think Rebecca did a tally, and we've got over 60 dead common terns were documented from Sandy Point, which is crazy. But so I know this is a busy slide, but all that stuff in the middle is just some of the preliminary testing results that we got back from UConn. But basically, I'm going to zip down to the results here. We have results on about half the samples that were submitted, and it's basically a disseminated bacterial infections causing blood poisoning, inflammation of the membranes around organs, and lesions on the liver. So unfortunately, the bacterial cultures were not consistent across all of those samples. So that's a bit of a bummer, but talking with a pathologist, she said that the lesions appear consistent. So still trying to figure it out. There's, like I said, another half of those samples were worked on by another pathologist, and they're gonna put their results together and kind of give us a better picture. But she sent me some slides, which I thought were kind of cool. up here, all these purple, the top slide here, which is it's a cross section of some of the tissues, and all that, those purple dots are just bacteria within, I don't know what organ it is, but and then the slide below it, you can see that same purple all in a band along, you know, this tissue. And that was one of the things that the pathologist said, is that those membranes around the organs was really packed with bacteria. So yeah. So there was some noticed posturing, like, and Rebecca, if you want to jump in, please feel free at the end. But the birds that were sick were sitting on the beaches with a particular posture, and some of them exhibited some head bobbing, which can be due to bacterial infection. We had some early hypotheses about potentially the two big bunker die-offs that happened this summer could be source of a Vibrio virus, I think it is, but that was implicated in a tern mortality event over in Europe. So the pathologists are also looking at Vibrio. And I talked to my counterparts in other states, and they unfortunately were not noticing any tern mortalities at their sites, but there was a gull mortality event at Cape Cod kind of around the same time. So we did have some dead gulls that were picked up during the tern mortality event. So I'm not sure if those are correlated or not. All right. This slide is not advancing. Technical difficulties. Huh. My computer is frozen. Can people still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. I can't even exit out of here. Okay, well, my computer's frozen, so I will, or the program is frozen, I should say, because I can still move my cursor around. Anyhow, so that was pretty much all I had to say. My last slide was just a thank you to all of the Audubon Alliance partners. I think we make a great team and we get a lot done. I want to thank the Rhode Island National Wildlife Refuges for monitoring Stony Point for me. I also wanted to thank Rebecca Foster, who I could not do this without, and also some of the deep folks that lent a hand, Tyler, Caroline, and Sandra, who helped out, and everyone who helped out with the Plover census. I really appreciated you going out and checking out all those extra beaches for me, and also anyone who picked up my slack this year for being on the injured reserve list. I appreciate you doing so. So thanks so much. If anyone has any questions, let me know. My program is still frozen, so.
Okay, well, thank you. And you know, I'm sure when the webinar ends, at least then maybe it'll unfreeze, but you can open it up now to, you know, anybody who has questions, you know, feel free to either throw them in the chat, or if you want to, you know, raise your hand, you can do that too. Oh, hey, there it goes. It closed.
There we go.
But
Hallelujah.
answer any questions that you have. But, you know, again, I just want to echo what Laura said. We want to thank you all for your help this season. And you know, you guys, you know, definitely play a role in sort of being out on the beach and, you know, talking to people on the beach, you know, helping us keep an eye on things, helping us sort of, you know, double check our numbers, that sort of thing. You know, we really appreciate all the work that you all do. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much. We have a quiet group tonight.
Just want to say that we're, you know, looking forward to next season, and we're already starting to think about some ways that we can reduce disturbance to, you know, migrating shorebirds, time, you know, put out better information about when to visit and when not to visit Milford Point, you know, try to time our, you know, any of our educational programming so that it's not in the vulnerable tide periods. And then we're also hopefully going to be working with law enforcement in combination with Audubon, Connecticut and Robert LaFrance, and we'll hopefully we'll come up with some more outside of the box thinking to get better law enforcement response time.
One question in the chat that I'll throw out there for anybody to answer. So suggestions for how to educate photographers who want to catch their shot but aren't taking their pictures at a respectful distance. You know, I think one thing to highlight to photographers is that, you know, they may be there trying to take their pictures for, you know, half an hour, 20 minutes, but, you know, you want to point out to them that somebody else might have been there before them and somebody else might be coming after them, you know, and so that, you know, it's a lot of people kind of contributing to the, to the problem, and that, you know, it kind of, you know, if they are going to be there, they really need to give the birds plenty of space and be mindful of being there for as short a time as possible. You know, I think kind of, you know, because it's kind of, you know, the challenge with photographers or people who are just getting too close to the birds, you know, is it's collective, it's cumulative, you know, so if you have, you know, just if it was literally just one person taking a photo over the course of a half an hour, it's maybe not a huge deal, but if you consider the cumulative impact of many people over many days coming and taking photos of the birds and not necessarily respecting their space, that's when it really becomes a problem.
Yeah, you know, and I think that it isn't necessarily how close you are to the birds. And I think, you know, we were just talking about that today with the snowy owl that showed up here in Stratford, and people were getting pretty close to it. But, you know, it's not always 100% perfect, but observing behavior can be very important. You know, sometimes you can tell when the plovers are nervous. They start making a lot of noise. You know, you could be, 50 yards away from a plover and they might be upset by your presence and start, it really depends on the plover. Others of them, you could just sort of sit on the beach and they'll come right up to you. So, a good rule of thumb is you sort of, because they're a federally threatened species, you really shouldn't pursue them. You should kind of set up somewhere on the beach, and especially if it's a falling tide, it doesn't create all that much disturbance, because when they're out foraging, they're kind of curious and they don't really care about you laying there on the beach. But it's when you're sort of pushing them up into the uplands at high tide, or if you're, really young chicks that need to be sheltered by their parents, little things that you can't even, really expect might happen. Like you might push the plovers just a little bit down the beach, or you might be pushing the oyster catchers a little bit down the beach. And all of a sudden you got plovers and oyster catchers together. And then the plovers and the adult plovers and the oyster catchers are fighting, and the oyster catchers are trying to grab the plover chicks. And, you can create these conflicts that you're not even aware of if you're not observing. It's obviously not entirely perfect. People were with this owl today. I don't think anybody ever flushed it. It's really not a black and white issue. Some situations will let you get close to the bird. Generally, with piping plovers, it's when that bird gets close to you. So it's kind of it's not an easy black or white answer. Having the proper equipment is important. Don't try and get, these on, some of these inexpensive cameras for around $500-600 can zoom up to 60x optically, which can get you some darn good pictures. There's some other things too, like, going early in the morning when there aren't going to be that many people there, the light's going to be better as well. You're not going to have as much sclera over the sand. In the heat of a day, you could get as close as you want to the birds and your pictures are still going to be horrible because there's so much interference coming off the sand. Or if you're on the wrong side of the light of the bird, I see that people trying to sneak up on a bird, with the sun behind it. I'm like, you're going to get terrible pictures anyway. And you're, getting, so there's a lot of complexity to ethical bird photography, particularly ethical shorebird photography, but it's not impossible.
I just want to echo before we move on real quick. Patrick, you made the point of really the bird's behavior. And I think that's the best thing you can do to educate folks on, what's really going on, being able to read the birds and know when you are actually causing a disturbance. Some of the incidents, plovers, they can run around and feed themselves when they hatch. Oyster catchers, they have to rely on their parents. If the adults are being disturbed, they can't go out and find food and come back and feed the chick. So each species is different, and just being able to read the behavior and educating folks on that. And it kind of makes you more interested and excited about the bird when you actually know what's going on and why they're screaming at you. So I'm going to stop there. And Corey, there was actually a great message in there about Great Meadows, if you wanted to take a look.
I can.
Very quickly, I'll say, during that time when you have chicks running around on the beach, I always recommend photographing butterflies instead. Just limit your time out there. But again, just it's fieldcraft. It's using those birds to tell you whether or not that you're getting too close or if you're in the wrong space. But yeah, butterflies are great too. Stay on the mainland.
Good suggestion, Steph.
And also sometimes like what nest you might choose is also good. I mean, like, for example, the birds that tend on the nest in a busy area, like there's some at the base of Sandy Point and some at the base of Milford Point where there's a lot of people out there. And those birds are kind of used to people. Whereas if you're at a little bit relative to Griswold Point, though, where they don't see all that many people. And I'm not talking about chasing those birds around. I'm talking about kind of sitting in an area where there's a lot of traffic already, and then the birds will kind of come to you. So, there are ways, there are little tricks, but it's something you have to be very mindful of.
And sometimes it depends too on how much of a buffer we can create with string fencing too. Like, I think your example of the ones at Sandy Point, kind of where by the parking lot there, we're able to kind of mark off a pretty big area. So I think that they can eke out, a nest there, no problem. But so I understand what you're saying, but I don't know. The purist in me always wants to think we should always do the best we can. And so I don't know. I'm gonna stop talking.
No, I mean, it is definitely, I mean, they are state and federally threatened species, and we don't want to do anything that harms them. But, it's not a black or white situation. I think it's complicated. Somebody like Paul Fusco, he's going to get, I know that no matter how great his bird photo was, he was sort of set up, in the right direction, and that bird, came up to him. I have actually great photos of birds doing broken wing displays this year. It's because 3 other people were changing the exclosure while I was taking pictures of the bird. So there are situations where you can get pictures where you otherwise wouldn't, it wouldn't be good. Or volunteer to go, string fencing if you want set up. If you want good pictures of the adults, the best time of year is, March and early April before they're actually nesting. And they can be quite accommodating.
I'll second that one. That's a great time of year to go see the birds is, March and April when they're just arriving before they have active nests.
everybody wants the chick pictures, and I will tell you that it's hard to get chick pictures. You know, these little chicks, yeah, even if you have the right equipment, even if you have the right, it's not an easy thing. So there's no sense chasing chicks up and down the beach, because you'll still probably just end up getting a bunch of bad photos because your camera doesn't like to focus on the camouflage.
Okay, well, there was one question about the Great Meadows Marsh Restoration Project, and I can kind of take that one, just give a brief overview of that. For folks who don't know, there is going to be a salt marsh restoration project taking place in the Great Meadows Marsh, which is a unit of the Stuart B. McKinney over in Stratford. Audubon, Connecticut is working on that with the state of Connecticut, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and with the NOAA Restoration Center. And the project is actually going to be getting started this week. The construction company that's doing the bulk of the dirt moving is actually starting to get out there this week and start to drop off some equipment. And there'll be the bulk of the restoration will take place between now and the end of March. Most of the time, the railroad trail that's on Long Beach Boulevard will be open, and you'll be able to actually continue to visit the refuge and maybe kind of see what's going on from a distance. But what the project entails, in as short a way as I can explain it, is there was dredge material that was deposited in that marsh, I think roughly in the 1950s. And so this project is going to be removing a lot of that dredge material, removing the invasive Phragmites grasses that have been growing on top of that material, removing some culverts that are no longer functioning and sort of prevent the natural ebb and flow of water in and out of the marsh. There's going to be there are going to be tidal creeks that are going to be either reconnected or created, again, to actually increase the amount of water that's able to flow in and out of the marsh. A healthy marsh is one that has lots of tidal creeks, and salt water can get in, which can do things like keep invasive plants at bay, and can kind of bring little like fish into the salt marsh as well. And then when the tide goes out, you get this sort of drier period as well. So that's sort of naturally what happens in a salt marsh. But things like ditching or creating berms, in a marsh, or putting dredge materials in a marsh can obviously disrupt that. So there'll be tidal creeks that are created, and then there is a section of trail that's been closed for a long time that's going to be reopened. One viewing platform is going to be taken down, but there'll be two going up to replace it. And there'll be an enormous planting effort come the spring. We're going to be putting about 6,000 shrubs and 170,000 salt marsh grass plugs and other perennial plugs in the ground. So if folks want to volunteer in the spring, April and May, by all means, feel free to email me. We would love to have as much help as possible. In terms of how that will benefit the birds, I think all those native plants will definitely be a great thing for songbirds that are passing through. There's a component of the project that is specifically to sort of test out a sort of potential technique for giving salt marsh sparrow a sort of way of adapting and to sort of sea level rise. Salt marsh sparrow is the sort of bird species that is the most at risk from sea level rise. Many of you on the call might know that they nest literally right above the high tide line. And when they show up in the spring, they sort of time their nesting with the sort of full moon high tide. So they sometimes they show up and then there's a full moon high tide and all their nests get washed out and then they have to start over again, kind of like plovers. But they show up, they get there, they sort of start nesting as soon as the full moon high tide has passed, and then they've got 26 days approximately to get their nest in. But with sea level rise, that period is shrinking, and a lot of salt marsh sparrow nests are drowning to the point where the population is declining at about 9% per year. So this project is going to include creating these hummocks, or these sort of mounds, in the vicinity of areas where salt marsh sparrow have nested in previous years. These mounds will be maybe a half a foot to a foot above sort of the area where the salt marsh sparrow are nesting. And the hope is that the birds will choose to nest on top of these these hummocks. And then those nests on top of the hummocks will be more resilient when it comes to these high tides. And, it's a strategy that, has only been tried out, as far as I know, at 2 other locations. So this is sort of the 3rd place where it's being tried, and it is sort of just it's a test to sort of see if this is a strategy that might be used to give salt marsh sparrow a fighting chance, as sea level rise predictions for the next century are not looking too good. So, but that's kind of the really cool bird aspect of the project is hopefully it will prove to be a technique that can be used to help us maintain our salt marsh sparrow populations.
Hey, Corey, what are those hummocks going to be made of?
They're going to be made of mostly of sort of soil, so some of the dredge material that is going to be sort of dug up, the stuff that does not have Phragmites roots mixed into it. They're going to use that. They might put like a layer on top that's kind of a little bit better for planting. But mostly they're sort of just reusing some of the dredge material that is kind of considered clean of invasive plants.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to volunteer, we'd love to have as many volunteers as possible come the spring. I think we're envisioning, maybe 1 or 2 days each weekend for a number of weekends. There'll be kind of planting parties out at Great Meadows where you can come and help us, plant salt marsh grasses to your heart's content. But we really would appreciate any help that people can provide. Okay, any other questions about piping plovers, least terns, oyster catchers? Okay, well, I want to thank you all again for all your help this season. And it's always amazing how quickly the next season starts up. So I'm sure we'll be in touch roughly in February about, piping plover monitor training for next year. And, fingers crossed. Actually, I think this year was, despite all the challenges, I'm pretty happy with a 1.33 productivity for plovers and a 1.6 productivity for oyster catchers. That's actually pretty good. But hopefully next year we won't have all of the challenges we had, and maybe our productivity will be even higher. That would be amazing. And I hope you guys are all part of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Making a huge difference.
Bye. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great night. See you in a few months.
See you soon.
All right, thanks. Great program.
Bye-bye.